The sound reaches you before dawn, metal scraping on metal. 18,000 iron pike heads catching the first gray light over the Mesopotamian plain. You're standing in the third rank of the Macedonian phalanx, and your arms are already tired from holding the sarissa at the ready position. The weapon weighs maybe 15 pounds, but you've been at parade rest since the stars were still out. It's October 1st, 331 BCE, and somewhere across this dusty expanse, Darius III has assembled an army that outnumbers you 5-1. Your hands are positioned about 4 feet apart on the cornel wood shaft. The pike extends 18 feet total, 13 feet of it reaching out in front of you. The man in the first rank has his pike point at chest height. The second rank aims slightly higher. Yours, in the third rank, angles up to clear their heads. Behind you, 12 more ranks hold their sarissas at progressively higher angles, creating a forest of iron points that extends 15 feet beyond the front line of shields. From a distance, the morning light catching those pike heads looks like a wave frozen in mid-crash. The smell is what you'll remember later. Dust and sweat, obviously. The oil you rubbed into the wood last night, trying to keep the shaft from splintering. But also something sharper. Fear, maybe. Though nobody will name it. And underneath everything, the smell of the plain itself, baked earth and dry grass, so different from the green valleys of Macedonia where you learned to do this. A single voice carries across the formation. The command to lower pikes. 18,000 shafts come down as one. The sound is like a sudden wind through a forest, wood creaking, men grunting with effort. Now the sarissa points straight ahead, parallel to the ground, supported by your left hand pushing forward and your right hand gripping near the back for leverage. Your small shield, just 2 feet across, hangs from your left forearm. It's not enough protection, not really, but that's not the point. The protection comes from the pike heads. 5 rows of iron points extending 15 feet ahead of your line. Nothing can reach you through that. Tonight, I'm taking you inside Alexander the Great's army to experience the daily reality of the weapon that conquered the known world. Not his genius, not his courage. A piece of wood, an iron, that weighed 15 pounds and changed warfare forever. Most people have never heard its name. The sarissa, an 18-foot pike that turned poor Macedonian farmers into the most feared infantry in the ancient world. The sun is rising now. The Persian line, when you can finally see it, seems to extend forever in both directions. Cavalry on the flanks, chariots with scythes attached to their wheels, infantry in the center wearing armor that catches the light. They look magnificent and terrifying. You can hear the phalanx around you breathing. Someone 3 ranks back is praying quietly. The man directly behind you, Philippos, from a village 2 valleys over from yours, has his pike resting against your shoulder. You can feel it trembling slightly. The deadliest weapon of Alexander the Great wasn't a sword or a siege engine. It was this 18 feet of cornel wood and iron, multiplied by thousands, wielded by men who had drilled together until they moved as one body. But the story doesn't begin here, on this plain, with the Persian Empire about to fall. It begins 30 years earlier, in the muddy mountains of Macedonia, with a king who inherited a broken kingdom and needed a solution that didn't cost much money. Macedonia in the 350s BCE was not an impressive place. The kingdom occupied the mountains and valleys north of Greece proper. Wheat and timber country. The kings claimed descent from Heracles, but that didn't put silver in the treasury or discipline in the army. Greek city-states to the south called Macedonians barbarians, not quite civilized, not quite Greek, speaking a dialect that sounded rough and provincial. The military situation was worse. Illyrian tribes raided from the northwest. Thracians pressed from the northeast. The Greek city-states to the south viewed Macedonia with contempt when they bothered to think about it at all. When Philip II became king in 359 BCE, he inherited an army that had just lost 4,000 men in a single disastrous battle. The survivors were demoralized. The tactics were obsolete. Philip understood the problem. Greek hoplite warfare centered on the hoplon, the large round shield that protected you from neck to knee. Hoplites fought in tight formation, shield, overlapping shield, pushing forward as a mass. They carried 8-foot spears and short swords. It was a rich man's style of fighting. A full set of hoplite armor cost as much as a small farm. Bronze cuirass, greaves, helmet, the big shield itself, it all required money that Macedonia didn't have. The Persian Empire employed a different system. Their strength lay in cavalry and archers. Persian infantry were lighter troops, wearing less armor, relying on mobility and numbers. They were formidable when properly supported, but in a straight infantry fight against Greek hoplites, they usually lost. The Greeks had proven that at Marathon and Plataea. Philip needed something new. His kingdom couldn't afford to arm every soldier as a hoplite. His people weren't horsemen like the Persians. But Macedonia had timber, vast forests of cornel and ash, and it had men, farmers and shepherds, who couldn't afford bronze, but could train.
The innovation happened gradually. Some historians credit Philip himself with inventing the sarissa. Others suggest he adapted it from earlier experiments with longer spears. What we know for certain is that by the late 350s BCE, Macedonian soldiers were drilling with pikes twice as long as a hoplite spear. The first sarissas were probably 14 feet, long enough to outreach any hoplite spear, short enough that soldiers could still manage them. Over time, the length increased, 16 feet, 18 feet. Some sources mention 20-foot pikes, though those may have been used only for parades or for the front ranks in special circumstances. The wood came from cornel trees, known for their density and flexibility. The shaft was made in 2 pieces, joined by a bronze tube in the middle. This made transport easier and allowed for replacement of broken sections. The iron point was shaped like a long leaf, socketed to fit over the shaft. The butt end received a bronze spike, heavy enough to counterbalance the forward weight and sharp enough to plant in the ground during rest. Making thousands of these required organizations Macedonia had never attempted. Workshops in Pella, the capital, specialized in pike production. Foresters marked specific cornel groves for military harvesting. Smiths produced standardized iron points. The logistics alone represented a revolution in how Macedonia approached warfare. But the real challenge wasn't making the weapon, it was teaching men to use it. A hoplite could learn his basic job in a few weeks. Hold your shield, keep formation, push forward when ordered. The tactics were straightforward because the equipment was simple. The sarissa demanded more, much more. On your first day of training with the sarissa, you dropped it 3 times. The pike seemed impossibly long, impossibly awkward. When you tried to level it, the front end wobbled. When you tried to march with it, you tangled it in the man beside you. The drill instructor, a scarred veteran named Parmenion, who claimed to have trained with Philip himself, watched with no expression. The pike is lighter than a hoplite shield. 15 pounds against 30. You're going to hold it all day, so make friends with it. The grip position was specific. Left hand forward, palm up, bearing most of the weight. Right hand about 4 feet back, controlling direction. Small shield strapped to your left forearm, just enough to deflect arrows, not enough to stop a direct spear thrust. That was fine. The sarissa would keep enemy spears 15 feet away. For 2 weeks, you drilled without moving, just holding the pike level until your arms screamed. The man to your right was Cletus, a farmer's son from the highlands. The man to your left was Antigonus, who had worked in his father's smithy. In the phalanx, these men would become more important to you than your own family. The formation was everything. 16 ranks deep, each rank standing 3 feet behind the one ahead, shoulder to shoulder with no gaps. The first 5 ranks held their pikes forward at progressively higher angles, creating that hedge of iron points extending beyond the front line. Ranks 6 through 16 held their pikes at steeper angles, mostly to deflect arrows and protect the formation from above. You don't stab with this weapon, Parmenion told you. You present it. The pike points are a wall. The enemy impales themselves trying to reach you. The sound of the formation drill became the rhythm of your days. Stomp and clatter as 1,600 boots hit the ground together. The creak of leather and wood. Commands in Macedonian, the broad dialect of the hills, not the refined Greek of the cities. Dress the line, close the files, advance. Advancing was the hardest part. 3 feet per step, maintaining perfect alignment. If anyone rushed forward or lagged behind, pikes tangled. The whole formation could collapse. You learned to move by feel as much as sight, sensing Cletus and Antigonus on either side, the pike of the man behind you touching your back, letting you know he was there. As we march through these drills, and if you are finding these details as fascinating as I do, tap subscribe for more journeys into the daily life of history's soldiers, the stuff they don't put in the victory monuments. After 6 weeks, you could march in formation for an hour without breaking stride. After 3 months, you could execute a wheeling maneuver, the entire phalanx pivoting while maintaining the hedge of points. After 6 months, you no longer thought about where to put your hands or how to angle the pike. It became automatic, like breathing. The phalanx is drilled every day, even in winter. Especially in winter. Philip wanted soldiers who could maintain formation in mud, in river crossings, in the chaos of battle. The sarissa required discipline that went beyond courage. A brave man with a sword could charge alone. A man with an 18-foot pike was useless without the 15 men in his file and the 31 men on either side of him. Nighttime in the training camp brought different sounds. Men repairing their pikes by firelight, the scrape of whetstones on iron points, conversations in low voices, complaining about the drills, wondering when they'd actually fight, telling stories about girls back home. The camp smelled of wood smoke and cooking barley, leather oil and sweat, the particular smell of hundreds of men living in close quarters. The physical toll was real. Your hands developed calluses in new places. Your shoulders ached constantly for the first 3 months until the muscles adapted. You learned to sleep despite the soreness, learned to wake instantly at the sound of the assembly call, and learned to eat whatever food appeared because the drilling burned energy faster than you'd imagined. But something else happened too. The 16 men in your file became a unit.
You knew how Philippos breathed when he was nervous. You knew Kleitos always shifted his weight to his right leg during long formations. You knew the sound of Antigonos sharpening his pike point, distinct from anyone else's rhythm. This cohesion was what Philip had built into the system. A hoplite fought for his own glory and honor. A phalangite fought because breaking formation meant the men beside him died. The sarissa was useless in individual combat, too long, too unwieldy, but in formation, supported by men who had trained beside you for months, it became devastating. By your first year's end, the phalanx could advance in formation across broken ground, wheel 90 degrees on command, halt and lower pikes in perfect unison. The sarissa no longer felt awkward in your hands. It felt like an extension of your arms. The weight was familiar. The balance point was instinctive. Philip reviewed the formations personally. The king rode along the ranks on his black horse, watching the pike points, checking alignment. He didn't give speeches about glory or honor. He wanted to see the drill done perfectly, again and again, until perfection was boring. "The Persians will have numbers," Parmenion told your file one evening. "They'll have cavalry and gold and chariots. They'll look magnificent. But they've never faced this. They don't know how to fight a formation they can't reach." The fire crackled. Someone was mending his tunic. The smell of barley porridge hung in the air. Tomorrow would bring more drilling, the same commands, the same movements, adding tiny refinements. It should have been tedious. Somehow it wasn't. You were becoming something Macedonia had never produced before, professional infantry that could meet anyone on the battlefield. The sarissa changed how you thought about space. 18 feet is longer than most rooms. In close quarters, inside buildings, in narrow streets, the weapon became a liability. But on open ground, those 18 feet meant power. Imagine facing the phalanx as an enemy. You're a Persian infantryman, carrying a 9-foot spear and a wicker shield. You advance toward what looks like a Macedonian line. Then, at a shouted command, the forest of pikes comes down. Suddenly, there are 5 rows of iron points reaching toward you, the nearest one 15 feet away from the Macedonian line. Your 9-foot spear gives you 0 chance of reaching an enemy soldier. Even if you somehow closed the distance, knocked aside the first pike point, there are 4 more behind it. The psychological impact preceded the physical one. Soldiers who had never seen the sarissa before would stop, confused about how to proceed. That hesitation was often fatal. The phalanx didn't stop. It advanced steadily, 3-foot steps, the pike wall moving forward like a slow avalanche of iron. Philip first used the reformed Macedonian army against Illyrian tribes in 358 BCE. The sources from that period are fragmentary, but we know the Illyrians had defeated Macedonia badly just years before. Now, facing the pike phalanx for the first time, their charges broke against it. They couldn't reach the Macedonian line. Their own casualties mounted while they struggled to figure out a response. Over the next 20 years, Philip campaigned constantly. Each battle refined the tactics. Each victory recruited more soldiers. Macedonia's population couldn't supply unlimited infantry, so Philip enrolled allies and tributaries into phalanx formations. The training system spread. More drill instructors, more standardized equipment. By 340 BCE, Macedonia could field multiple phalanx brigades, each 1,600 men, each drilled to the same standard. The Greeks noticed. Athens and Thebes, the traditional military powers, initially dismissed the Macedonian reforms. Mountain barbarians playing soldiers. They learned otherwise in Chaironeia in 338 BCE. Philip's phalanx, combined with cavalry under young Alexander, crushed the Greek alliance. The sarissa and the tactics built around it had defeated classical hoplite warfare on its own ground. Philip died 2 years later, assassinated during a wedding celebration. The exact circumstances remain murky. Conspiracy theories abounded then, as now. What mattered for the army was that Alexander, just 20 years old, inherited not only a kingdom, but a military machine unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Alexander had trained with the Sarissa since childhood. He understood not just how to use it, but why it worked. The weapon was never meant to stand alone. It was one piece of a system that included cavalry, light infantry, archers, and siege equipment. But it was the essential piece. The Sarissa fixed the enemy in place. Everything else exploited the opportunities that were created. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia with about 30,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and supplies for maybe 30 days. The Persian Empire had been the dominant power in the Near East for 2 centuries. It controlled Egypt, Babylon, and lands stretching to India. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its treasury held wealth beyond calculation. Alexander's advantage was the Sarissa and the men who wielded it. The Persians didn't understand what they were facing, not at first.
The Granicus River in northwestern Turkey runs cold, even in May. The water comes down from the mountains and the bottom is rocky with patches of mud. You reach the river in late afternoon, sun still high, and saw the Persian army arrayed on the far bank. They held the high ground. Persian cavalry stretched along the eastern bank, maybe 20,000 horsemen, with their commanders in bright armor at the front. Behind them, Greek mercenary infantry, hoplites in Persian pay. The defensive position looked solid. Crossing the river would leave Alexander's army vulnerable during the climb up the muddy bank. The Macedonian command debated waiting until morning. Alexander decided to attack immediately. The cavalry would cross first, drawing attention and creating chaos. Then the phalanx would ford the river and establish formation on the far side. You waded into the Granicus in the 2nd Phalanx Brigade. The water reached your thighs, current strong enough to require concentration. Your shield was useless for balance, too small, strapped to your arm. The Sarissa was worse than useless. The 18-foot length caught the current like a sail. You held it high, nearly vertical, trying to keep the iron point dry. Around you, hundreds of other pikes pointed skyward, bobbing as men struggled across. The sound was water rushing, men shouting, horses screaming somewhere to your right where the companion cavalry had engaged. You couldn't see the fighting. The riverbank blocked your view, but you could hear metal on metal, voices in Persian and Macedonian. The smell was river water and mud, sharp and mineral. Formation discipline held, despite the crossing. Each man kept his position relative to the others. When you reached the far side and climbed the muddy bank, the files closed automatically. Pikes came down, the hedge formed. You were breathing hard from the crossing, legs shaking from fighting the current, but the drill took over. Dress the line, close files, advance. The Persian cavalry had committed to stopping Alexander's horsemen. They didn't notice the phalanx forming on the riverbank until it was too late. When they turned to charge, they saw the pike wall waiting. Horses won't charge into a hedge of points like that. They can't. The riders pulled up, confused, looking for a gap. The phalanx advanced. 3-foot steps, perfect alignment, the creak of thousands of leather straps and wood shafts. The Persian cavalry fell back. Some tried to ride around the flanks, but Alexander's light cavalry screened those approaches. Others attempted to throw javelins, but the phalanx had been trained for this. The rear ranks raised their pikes high, deflecting most projectiles. Those that got through hit the small shields or glanced off helmets. The real fighting happened when the phalanx reached the Greek mercenaries. These men understood hoplite warfare, but the Sarissa gave Macedonia a 5-foot reach advantage. The Greeks tried to close, hoping to get inside the pike length where they could use swords. The phalanx didn't allow it. Forward pressure, constant movement. The front rank replaced immediately when men fell. The pike points found gaps in armor, punched through shields, created a grinding, brutal combat where one side could strike and the other couldn't. You weren't in the front ranks, so you didn't see the details, you felt them. The resistance when pikes hit something solid, the shuddering when the whole formation pushed forward. The smell changed from river water to blood and open bodies. The sound of wounded men, Persian and Greek and Macedonian alike, because no battle is clean, no matter how sophisticated your tactics. The fight at Granicus lasted maybe 2 hours total. The Persian cavalry retreated when their commanders fell. The Greek mercenaries tried to surrender, but Alexander had them cut down. A brutal message to Greeks who fought for Persian gold. Your phalanx held formation throughout. When the command came to halt and raise pikes, your arms trembled with exhaustion. The Sarissa suddenly felt heavier than it ever had in training. That night, camped on the battlefield, you cleaned your pike point by firelight. Blood rusts iron quickly, and you couldn't afford a pitted blade. The smell of death hung over everything, but nobody talked about it. Cletos had taken a javelin in the shoulder, not serious, but he'd need a few days before he could hold the Sarissa properly. Philippos was fine but quiet, staring into the fire. Antigonus told a joke that wasn't funny, just to break the silence. The Sarissa had done what Philip designed it to do. It had made Persian cavalry irrelevant. It had killed Greek mercenaries who should have been evenly matched. It had turned a risky river crossing into a victory that opened Western Asia to Alexander's advance. But Granicus was just the start. The weapon would face its real test against Darius III himself, against the full might of the Persian Empire assembled in one place.
Alexander didn't just command the phalanx. He used it the way a smith uses an anvil, as the fixed point against which everything else strikes. The real killing, the decisive maneuvers, came from the cavalry. This combination, Sarissa and horse, was the actual innovation that changed warfare. The companion cavalry rode on the right flank, Alexander at their head. These were Macedonian nobles, sons of the highland aristocracy, mounted on the best horses the kingdom could breed. They trained from childhood, and their primary weapon was a 12-foot lance called a ziston, long for cavalry use, but manageable on horseback in a way the Sarissa never could be. The tactic was geometric. The phalanx fixed the enemy center in place. Enemy forces couldn't advance against the pike wall, couldn't retreat without breaking, couldn't maneuver freely. They were pinned. Meanwhile, Alexander led the companion cavalry in an oblique charge toward a specific point, usually a seam in the enemy formation or directly at the enemy commander. The cavalry strike created chaos and breakthrough. Enemy formations collapsed from that single point of pressure. Then the phalanx advanced, exploiting the gap, rolling up the flanks. Light infantry, Agrianians from Thrace, expert javelin men, screened the phalanx's vulnerable flanks and pursued routing enemies. This system required timing that came from years of campaigning together. The phalanx couldn't advance too early, or they'd lose cohesion. The cavalry couldn't charge too late, or the enemy might wheel to meet them. Light infantry had to know when to screen and when to clear out. It orchestrated violence on a scale that demanded professional soldiers at every level. After Granicus, the army moved south along the coast. Persian strongholds surrendered or fell to siege. The navy, supplied by Phoenician cities, switched sides or scattered. Within a year, Alexander controlled the western coast of Asia Minor. The Persian Empire was vast, but Alexander had cut off its access to the Mediterranean. Darius III, the Persian king of kings, assembled a new army in Syria. This force was larger than the one at Granicus, better organized, commanded personally by the emperor. Darius chose his ground carefully, the coastal plain near Issus, where mountains prevented wide flanking maneuvers. The position was strong. Alexander's army reached Issus in November 333 BCE. The weather had turned cold, rain coming in from the sea. The plain was narrow, compressed between mountains and water. This was actually advantageous for Macedonia. It meant the Persian numbers couldn't deploy fully. Their vast army would be squeezed into a frontage not much wider than Alexander's. You marched south, with the phalanx in the center. The coastal plain stretched ahead, gray under heavy clouds. The Persian line was visible a mile away, looking like a dark smudge across the landscape. As you got closer, details emerged. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, Darius himself in the ceremonial chariot at the rear of the center, surrounded by his royal guard. The Persian infantry included Greek mercenaries again, plus Persian and Median soldiers armed with spears and large wicker shields. They looked formidable. Their line was deep, maybe 20 ranks, and their discipline seemed solid. On paper, they should have matched the phalanx. The Battle of Issus began with skirmishing. Persian archers launched volleys. Alexander's light troops returned fire. The phalanx stood in formation, rear ranks holding pikes high to deflect arrows. The waiting was worse than the fighting. Your mouth went dry. Your hands sweated on the sarissa shaft despite the cold. The command came to advance. The phalanx stepped off, that familiar 3-foot rhythm. The pike wall lowered. Ahead, the Persian line braced for impact. You couldn't see much, just the backs of the men ahead of you, the pikes extending forward, the gray sky above. The sound was boots on wet ground, thousands of men breathing in rhythm, the creak of wood and leather. The impact happened gradually. First a few pikes striking shields, then more. Then the entire front rank engaged. The grinding began. Your job in the third rank was to maintain forward pressure and keep your pike angled to threaten any enemy who got too close to the front. The man behind you pushed on your back. You pushed on the man ahead. The formation became a single mass of pressure and iron points. The Persian infantry fought well at first. They tried to grab the pike shafts, pull them aside, and create gaps. Some succeeded. Men in the front rank died. The second rank stepped forward immediately. The discipline held. This was what months of drilling had built, the ability to maintain formation even when men around you were falling, even when everything was chaos and blood and screaming. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a charge that broke through the Persian left wing. The timing was perfect. Just as the phalanx engaged and fixed the Persian center, the cavalry created the breakthrough. Persian forces tried to wheel to meet the new threat, which opened gaps in their center formation. The phalanx sensed the change before seeing it. The resistance ahead lessened. The pike points found less opposition. The order came to advance faster. The 3-foot steps became 5-foot strides. You were nearly running now, trying to maintain formation at increased speed, pikes still leveled. The momentum of thousands of men unstoppable. Darius, seeing his line collapsing and Alexander's cavalry cutting toward his position, made the decision that doomed Persia. He fled. Once the Persian emperor's chariot turned and raced north, his army knew the battle was lost. The retreat became a rout. The phalanx halted, exhausted. You stood gasping, arms burning from maintaining the pike position during the extended advance. Around you, men were collapsing to sitting positions, still holding their sarissas, too tired to do more than breathe. The smell was sweat and blood, churned mud, the acrid scent that comes from violent death. Issus proved what Granicus had suggested. The sarissa, wielded by trained professionals and coordinated with cavalry, could defeat any army in the world. Persian numbers meant nothing. Persian wealth meant nothing. The 18 feet of cornel wood had killed an empire's credibility.
People imagine ancient armies on the march as glorious. Dust and glory, banners and trumpets, victory on the horizon. The reality involves more mundane concerns, like how do you keep 18,000 pike shafts from breaking over hundreds of miles of marching? The logistics of the sarissa defined army life. Each phalangite carried his own pike, but the weapon was too long to carry at shoulder arms like a regular spear. Instead, you carried it horizontally, balanced across your shoulder, the butt end forward and the point trailing behind. In formation, this worked fine. On crowded roads, it was a nightmare. Pikes tangled with each other, with supply wagons, with cavalry horses. The baggage train carried spare shafts, replacement points, and bronze tubes for the central join. Philip had instituted a rule that each brigade needed spare equipment equal to 10% of its strength. That meant if you marched with a 1,600-man phalanx, you needed at least 160 spare sarissas in the wagons, plus spare shield components, armor straps, helmet liners, all the small pieces that broke constantly. Every evening, after the march halted and camp was established, you inspected your pike. The cornel wood was strong but not invincible. Cracks formed from stress. The bronze central tube sometimes loosened, making the pike wobble. The iron point could chip against rocks. The butt spike wore down from being planted in different soils night after night. Maintenance was mandatory, not optional. Parmenian had drilled this into you from the start. A broken sarissa in formation could kill the men beside you. So you sat by the fire along with everyone else in the file, inspecting wood for cracks, testing the central join, checking that the iron point was secure in its socket. The smell of the camps at night became familiar. Wood smoke, cooking barley or wheat, horse dung from the cavalry lines, the particular scent of many men living close together. Oil for treating wood and leather, the mineral smell of iron being sharpened on whetstones. Sometimes, in certain winds, you could smell the sea. The sounds were equally distinctive. Conversations in Macedonian, Greek, Thracian. The army recruited from across the kingdom and its allies. Horses neighing in the cavalry lines. The clang of the armorer's tent working on repairs. Someone singing, usually off-key. The sentries calling out the watch changes. After Issus, Alexander turned south instead of pursuing Darius immediately. He wanted to secure the entire Mediterranean coast before pushing into Persia's heartland. This meant sieges, Tyre, Gaza. Each city that resisted required siege equipment, towers, battering rams, catapults. The phalanx, trained for open battle, had to learn patience. Sieges changed the daily rhythm. Instead of marching, you drilled. Instead of fighting, you waited. The sarissa was useless against city walls, so phalangites worked on siege construction, hauled stones for catapults, and dug approach trenches. The weapon that had killed thousands in battle became dead weight during months of siege work. Gaza fell after 2 months. The garrison fought to the last man, and Alexander, angry at the delay, ordered harsh punishment of the survivors. These decisions, strategic and brutal, were remote from your level. You heard about them in camp gossip, news filtering down from the officers. Your concern was keeping your pike maintained, your position in the files secure, your equipment functional. The march into Egypt was easier. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. The phalanx marched through Alexandria, the city named for the king, but barely begun, and then into the desert,
Alexander visited the oracle at Siwa. The official story said the oracle confirmed Alexander's divine ancestry. What mattered practically was that Egypt was secured without major battles. Then the army turned east, toward Babylon, toward Persia proper, toward Darius, who was assembling a third army even larger than the one at Issus.
The decisive confrontation was coming. The march across Syria and into Mesopotamia took months. Summer heat replaced coastal winds. Dust became constant. Water sources were crucial. The baggage train stretched for miles behind the combat formations. You learned to sleep despite heat, dust, and the discomfort of the ground. You learned to eat whatever food appeared, often flatbread and dried fish, occasionally meat when the supply officers managed to purchase livestock from locals. Your hands developed deeper calluses. Your shoulders and arms grew stronger from daily pike drills. The physical adaptation to constant military life changed your body. You could march 20 miles with full equipment and still drill for an hour when camp was made. This endurance came from routine, the unforgiving daily grind that built capacity. Kletos recovered from his shoulder wound, but developed a limp from a different injury. He'd stepped wrong during a river crossing and turned his ankle badly. It didn't affect his position in the phalanx, but you noticed him favoring the leg during long marches. Philippos was courting a girl in the camp followers, daughter of a sutler who sold wine to the soldiers. Antigonus had been promoted to file leader, replacing the man who died of fever in Egypt. These details, small and personal, made up the texture of army life. The sarissa might be the weapon that conquered empires, but daily existence was maintenance and marching, drill and gossip, the small pleasures of food and rest and companionship. By early autumn 331 BCE, Alexander's army reached northern Mesopotamia. Scouts reported Darius ahead on a plain near a village called Gaugamela. The Persian emperor had chosen ground favorable for his forces, open, flat, perfect for cavalry and chariots. He'd even had his engineers smooth sections of the plain, removing obstacles that might hinder chariot charges. This was it, the final test. Everything Philip had built, everything Alexander had refined, came down to this battle. The sarissa would face the full might of Persia, assembled and prepared and waiting.
The night before Gaugamela, nobody slept much. You could see the Persian campfires stretched across the plain, thousands of them, far more than on the Macedonian side. Estimates varied wildly. Some said Darius had 100,000 men, others said more. The real number probably fell somewhere between 70 and 90,000. Alexander had maybe 47,000 total. The Persians outnumbered you significantly. Alexander ordered the army to rest, but he stayed up with his commanders, planning. You could see torches in the command tent, moving shadows of men gesturing, pointing at maps. The rumor spread that Parmenion had suggested a night attack, catch the Persians unprepared. Alexander refused. He wanted to win without tricks, and wanted the victory to be unquestionable. The phalanx formed before dawn. You took your position in the third rank, Kletos on your right, Antigonus on your left, Philippos behind. The sarissa was clean, oiled, the iron point sharp. Your small shield hung from your left forearm. The sky was still dark, stars fading as gray crept in from the east. The plain at Gaugamela is flat like a table, perfect ground for the phalanx. You could see the Persian line as dawn broke. Infantry in the center, cavalry on both flanks, chariots out front, elephants somewhere in the rear. Darius himself was visible in the center, his ceremonial chariot marked by tall standards. The formation Alexander chose was unusual. The phalanx in the center, as always, companion cavalry on the right, Thessalian cavalry on the left.
But then Alexander added a second line behind the entire army, facing rearward, a defensive measure in case the Persians tried to encircle. This formation within a formation showed how seriously Alexander took the numerical disadvantage. The battle began with the chariots. Darius sent them forward in a mass charge, scythed wheels meant to tear through infantry formations. The phalanx had been drilled for this. When the chariots closed, the ranks opened, files moving apart just enough to create lanes. Most chariots rolled through the gaps harmlessly. Those that didn't veer away found the pike wall closing around them. Horses impaled on 18-foot spears, drivers killed by the rear ranks while trapped inside the formation. It was brutal and efficient. The chariot attack failed completely. Maybe 15 minutes after it started, it was over. The lanes closed, the phalanx reformed. Not a single formation broke. Then the main lines engaged. Persian infantry advanced toward the Macedonian center. The phalanx lowered pikes and advanced to meet them. The impact was like Issus, but larger, louder, more violent. The entire center of the battlefield became a grinding mass of men and weapons. Your world narrowed to the few feet around you. The back of the man ahead, the pike extends forward, the pressure from behind, the smell of dust and sweat and fear. The sound was overwhelming, metal on metal, men screaming, officers shouting commands that you could barely hear. The Persian cavalry on the right flank charged the Thessalian cavalry. The Persian cavalry on the left flank charged toward the companion cavalry. Both wings erupted into chaotic cavalry melees. The phalanx held the center, pike wall unbreakable, advancing slowly against Persian infantry that couldn't reach the Macedonian line.
But you felt the change. The pressure ahead lessened. The Persian infantry, seeing Alexander's cavalry behind their line and threatening Darius himself, began to waver. Darius fled again. Just like at Issus, the sight of the emperor's chariot turning and running broke the Persian army's will. Units began to disengage. The retreat started. The phalanx, seeing the enemy pull back, pressed forward. The pursuit after Gaugamela covered miles. Persian forces scattered in every direction. Alexander's cavalry chased Darius northeast, trying to capture him. The phalanx halted on the battlefield, exhausted. You stood with your sarissa planted in the ground, leaning on it, breathing hard, too tired to feel victory or anything else. The casualty count for Macedonia was light, maybe 500 dead. Persian losses numbered in the tens of thousands. The sarissa and the tactics built around it had destroyed the largest army Persia could assemble. The empire was finished, even though fighting would continue for years. That night, you sat by the fire with your file. Someone passed around looted Persian wine. It was sweet, too sweet, mixed with spices you didn't recognize. Cleitos drank too much and got emotional, talking about his father who had died in Philip's early campaigns. Philippos was quiet, staring at the flames.
Antigonos cleaned his pike point for the third time, nervous energy with nowhere to go. The Sarissa had won the greatest battle of the ancient world, but the weapon was only as good as the men who held it. The drilling, the trust, the months and years of training that made you a phalanx, not just 16 individuals, that was the real secret. Philip had understood it, Alexander perfected it.
After Gaugamela, the war changed character. There was no Persian army left to face in open battle. Darius fled east and was eventually murdered by his own satraps. Alexander's campaign became a pursuit across the eastern provinces, then a conquest of regions that had never been part of Persia proper. The Sarissa faced new challenges. The weapon that dominated open plains struggled in mountains. It was useless in narrow valleys. It couldn't climb siege ladders. The phalanx, trained for set-piece battles, had to adapt to garrison duty, urban warfare, counterinsurgency against tribes that refused to submit. You marched into regions where Greek wasn't spoken, and Macedonian was meaningless. Bactria, Sogdania, mountains where the cold made your hands too numb to grip the pike properly. Deserts where water sources were contested. Forests where maintaining formation was impossible. The army changed too. Macedonian casualties, while light in battles, accumulated over years. Disease killed more men than combat. Garrison duty in conquered cities drained manpower.
Alexander began recruiting local troops, training them in the phalanx system. Persian and Median men learning to drill with the Sarissa, learning the commands in Macedonian, joining files alongside soldiers from Europe. This integration created tension. The original Macedonian veterans resented fighting beside men who had recently been enemies. The new recruits struggled with a military culture built over decades. Arguments erupted in camp. A few times, violence. Alexander enforced discipline harshly when needed, but the army's cohesion, built on shared background and experience, was fraying. In 327 BCE, the army crossed into India. The climate was wet, oppressively hot. Monsoon rains turned roads to mud. Equipment mildewed. Pike shafts warped in the humidity. You learned to store your Sarissa under cover every night. Learned to check obsessively for rot in the wood. The Indian campaign brought an enemy the Sarissa wasn't designed to face: war elephants. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, Alexander faced King Porus, whose army included about 200 elephants armored and trained for battle. The phalanx formed as usual. The pike wall came down. Then the elephants charged. Horses fear elephants and won't approach them. Infantry can theoretically kill elephants, aimed for the eyes, the trunk, the legs, but it requires getting close. The Sarissa kept you 15 feet away from anything you wanted to kill. That distance and advantage against human enemies became a problem against animals that could simply walk through the pike points.
The battle at Hydaspes was chaotic. Some elephants were stopped by concentrated pike thrusts. Others broke through the formation, trampling men, creating gaps that Indian cavalry exploited. The phalanx held in most places, but it was closer to defeat than at any time since Granicus. Alexander won by adapting tactics. Light infantry with javelins harassed the elephants. Cavalry struck from multiple angles, confusing the Indian formations. The phalanx served as anchor, not as the decisive weapon. This was new and unsettling. The Sarissa, which had seemed invincible, had limitations. The real crisis came at the Hyphasis River, the eastern limit of Alexander's advance. The army, exhausted from years of campaigning, refused to go farther. This wasn't mutiny, no violence, no threats, just a collective decision that enough was enough. Alexander wanted to continue east, to reach the ends of the earth. The soldiers wanted to go home. You attended the assembly where this played out. Alexander spoke of glory and achievement, about finishing what they'd started. The soldiers listened respectfully. Then an officer named Coinus stood and spoke for the army. Men were worn down. Equipment was failing.
They'd conquered more than any army in history. It was time to return. Alexander gave in, angry but practical. The army turned west. The return journey involved fighting down the Indus River, siege after siege in cities that preferred death to submission. At one siege, Alexander was nearly killed when he leaped into a fortress alone and the scaling ladder broke, cutting him off. The phalanx fought desperately to reach him. The king survived, but the incident showed how much the campaign had become about Alexander's personal ambition rather than rational strategy. The Sarissa, during this period, was a maintenance burden as much as a weapon. The climate destroyed equipment faster than it could be replaced. You carried the same pike for 3 years, repairing it constantly, replacing sections that rotted, filing down rust on the iron point. The weapon that had been pristine at Gaugamela was now a patchwork of replacements and field repairs. Other equipment fared worse. Shields fell apart, leather straps rotted. The linen armor that many phalangites wore absorbed moisture and never fully dried. Some men developed chronic coughs from sleeping in wet gear. Others suffered infections from minor wounds that wouldn't heal in the humidity. The return to Babylon took 2 years. Parts of the army marched west through the mountains, others sailed down the coast, suffering terribly from heat and lack of water. You marched through the desert north of the Persian Gulf, a nightmare journey where water was rationed and men died from heat exhaustion. When you finally reached Babylon in 324 BCE, the army that assembled barely resembled the force that had crossed the Hellespont 10 years earlier. The core remained, the phalanx brigades, the companion cavalry, but everything was worn down. Equipment, bodies, spirits. Alexander planned new campaigns, Arabia, Italy, more conquests. But in June 323 BCE, after a night of heavy drinking, he fell ill. The fever progressed quickly. Within 2 weeks, Alexander the Great was dead at age 32.
Alexander's death without a clear heir threw the empire into immediate crisis. The generals, the men who had commanded armies under Alexander, each had their own power base and ambitions. The unity that had held during Alexander's lifetime fractured. The phalanx remained, but its purpose had changed. Instead of conquering new territories, it fought civil wars, Macedonian against Macedonian. The Sarissa that had defeated Persians now killed soldiers who had trained together, fought together, and survived the march to India together. The wars of the successors, as historians call them, lasted for decades. Ptolemy took Egypt.
Seleucus took Syria and Mesopotamia and eventually Persia. Antigonus tried to reconstitute the whole empire and nearly succeeded. Lysimachus held Thrace. The fighting was constant, alliances shifting, battles frequent. The sarissa remained the dominant infantry weapon throughout. All the successor kingdoms maintained phalanx formations trained in the Macedonian style. The tactics were refined further. Pike lengths increased in some armies. Sources mention 21-foot sarissas, though handling those must have been nearly impossible. The largest battle between successor kingdoms happened at Ipsus in 301 BCE. Antigonus, trying to hold his territories against a coalition, fielded 70,000 infantry. The enemy coalition had 64,000. Both sides had massive phalanx formations armed with sarissas. The battle came down to which cavalry could break through and attack the phalanx from behind. Antigonus lost. He died on the battlefield, 80 years old, still trying to rebuild Alexander's empire. His death ended the last realistic attempt at reunification. The successor kingdoms settled into an equilibrium, where all were strong enough to defend, but none strong enough to conquer each other. The phalanx, by this point, had become formulaic.
The tactics that had been revolutionary under Philip were now standard. Every army had pikes, every army drilled in a similar formation. Battles between evenly matched phalanxes became grinding matches of attrition. The decisive breakthrough that Alexander had achieved repeatedly became harder to replicate when both sides understood the system. The sarissa faced a new challenge from the west, Rome. The Roman legion used different tactics, shorter swords, throwing javelins, more flexible formations. The first conflicts between Roman legions and Hellenistic phalanxes occurred in the late 200s BCE. At Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, the Roman consul Flamininus defeated Philip V of Macedon. The battle was complex, fought on broken ground where the phalanx couldn't maintain perfect formation. The Romans exploited gaps, got in close where the sarissa was useless, and used their short swords to deadly effect. The Macedonian phalanx, unstoppable on flat ground, struggled on hills and rough terrain. The decisive moment came at Pydna in 168 BCE. The Roman commander Aemilius Paulus faced Perseus of Macedon. The Macedonian phalanx advanced and initially pushed the Romans back. The sarissa was still terrifying to face, still effective when properly deployed. But as the phalanx advanced over uneven ground, gaps opened in the formation. Roman maniples, small, flexible units, penetrated those gaps. Once inside the formation, the Romans were fighting men who had 18-foot pikes and 2-foot shields. The battle became a massacre. Pydna ended Macedon as an independent kingdom.
Rome annexed it, and with it the homeland of the sarissa. The weapon that had conquered the known world had finally met tactics it couldn't overcome. But the sarissa didn't disappear immediately. The Seleucid Empire continued using phalanxes until it fragmented in the 100s BCE. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, maintained Macedonian-style infantry until Cleopatra's defeat in 30 BCE. The last recorded use of the sarissa in battle was probably sometime in the 1st century BCE, in one of the endless civil wars that marked the end of the Hellenistic period. What killed the sarissa wasn't a better weapon, it was changing tactical environments.
The weapon was designed for open plains where armies met in prearranged battles. As warfare became more irregular, fought in cities, mountains, forests, the 18-foot pike became a liability. Flexibility mattered more than reach. Individual soldiers with swords and shields could adapt to terrain and tactical situations in ways the rigid phalanx couldn't. The Roman legions, with their smaller units and short weapons, represented the future. The Macedonian phalanx represented a moment in military history that had passed. The sarissa, the deadliest weapon of Alexander the Great, became obsolete not through defeat in fair combat, but through irrelevance to new forms of war.
But for 200 years, the sarissa dominated. It shaped how kingdoms organized, how battles were fought, and how young men trained for war. Its influence extended beyond the battlefield into military culture, political structure, and social organization. The sarissa required professional soldiers, not militia. Citizens couldn't master the weapon in a few weeks of annual training. This meant standing armies, soldiers who fought for pay rather than civic duty. The economic implications were massive. Kingdoms had to maintain treasuries to pay armies year-round. Tax systems became more sophisticated to fund military establishments. The logistics systems developed to support armies with sarissas influenced how ancient kingdoms administered themselves. You couldn't march a phalanx army without extensive supply trains. You couldn't supply those trains without warehouses, depots, quartermasters, the whole apparatus of military administration. The bureaucracies that supported Alexander's campaigns became templates for governing the successor kingdoms. The sarissa also democratized military participation in a paradoxical way. Hoplite warfare had been aristocratic. Only wealthy men could afford the armor. The sarissa was cheaper. A cornel wood shaft and an iron point cost a fraction of a bronze panoply. This meant more men could serve, which meant larger armies, which meant the military balance shifted toward kingdoms that could recruit and train masses of men, rather than small numbers of wealthy warriors. The cultural legacy was equally significant. The image of the Macedonian phalanx, pike points glinting in sunlight, became the symbol of military excellence for centuries. Rulers who had no connection to Macedonia adopted the title king in the Macedonian style. Artists depicted phalanxes on monuments and coins. The sarissa became shorthand for military power. But the human cost was real. Hundreds of thousands of men spent years holding that 18-foot pike. Many died in battle. More died from disease, accidents, the ordinary casualties of military life. The soldiers who survived carried physical scars, the shoulder injuries from holding weight at arm's length, the lung damage from years of marching through dust, the psychological marks that any soldier carries. You, if you survived the wars, and many didn't, would have been discharged after Alexander's death or during the successor wars. The kingdoms paid veterans with land grants, trying to settle former soldiers in garrison colonies. These settlements spread Macedonian military culture across the eastern Mediterranean and Asia. A veteran's life meant farming land granted for service. The sarissa would hang in your house, probably kept out of respect or habit. Occasionally, in market towns, you'd meet other veterans.
The conversations would circle back to campaigns, battles, the names of men who died decades ago. Kleitos, who took the javelin at Granicus. Philippos, who died of fever in India. Antigonos, who made it through everything and went home to Macedonia to farm. The weapon itself would eventually rot. Cornel wood is durable but not eternal. The iron point would rust. The bronze fittings would corrode. Within a generation, the physical sarissa would be gone. But the memory would persist, the weight of it, the feel of the formation moving as one, the particular sound of thousands of pikes being lowered. Military historians study the sarissa as a technological innovation. The 18-foot length, the two-handed grip, the implications for formation warfare, these are analyzed in tactical terms. But for the men who held it, the sarissa was daily life. It was the tool that kept you alive. It was the center of training, discipline, and identity. It was heavy and awkward and absolutely essential. The deadliest weapon of Alexander the Great wasn't just a pike. It was the system built around the pike, the training, the logistics, the tactical coordination, the trust between men who held formation together. Philip invented it, Alexander perfected it. Tens of thousands of soldiers made it real.
The weapon conquered an empire. Then the empire fractured. Then the weapon became obsolete. Then it was forgotten by everyone, except historians, piecing together how warfare worked in a world that no longer exists. But for 200 years, if you heard the sound of 18,000 pike shafts being lowered, you knew what was coming. The hedge of iron points, the 3-foot advance, the grinding, brutal efficiency of the phalanx. The deadliest weapon of the ancient world measured in feet of cornel wood. The old veteran wakes before dawn, same as he's done for 50 years. His hands hurt, the joints swollen, the fingers not quite straight. The price of holding weight at arm's length for too many seasons. He sits on the edge of his sleeping bench, listening to his wife breathe softly in the darkness. The sarissa is in the corner, where it's been since he was discharged 30 years ago. The wood is gray now. The iron point has rust he can't quite polish away, but it's still there. He keeps it oiled, more from habit than necessity. Outside, the first birds are starting. Not the harsh crows of the Mesopotamian plain, but smaller birds, the ones native to these Greek hills where he was granted land. The air is cool. The season is turning.
Autumn is coming. He doesn't think about the battles much anymore. The memories are there if he reaches for them. The river crossing at Granicus, the charge at Gaugamela, the monsoon in India. But they feel distant, like stories someone told him about another person's life. What he remembers more clearly is smaller. The weight of the pike at dawn, Cleitus's bad jokes, the smell of the cooking fires, the sound of a formation drill, thousands of men moving together, the particular creak of leather and wood that meant the phalanx was ready. His children are grown. His grandchildren are learning to farm. None of them will ever hold a sarissa. The world has moved on.
The kingdoms that fought with pikes are gone or changed. Rome is ascendant. The future looks different. The veteran stands, joints protesting, and walks outside. The stars are fading. The eastern sky is showing gray. The air smells of turned earth and the olive trees on the slope below his house. It's quiet, peaceful. He thinks about his file. Philippos and Antigonos, dead in battles whose names he's forgotten. Cleitus, who made it home but died young of some sickness. The others scattered or gone. All of them connected once by 3-foot intervals and shared exhaustion and the unspoken certainty that they'd hold formation no matter what. The stars fade further. The sky lightens. The veteran breathes slowly, feeling the morning, the peace of it. The wars are over. The campaign is finished. The Sarissa in the corner is just wood and iron now. Its work is done. He sits on the bench outside his door. His wife will wake soon. There's work to do. The autumn planting, repairs to the fence, ordinary life continuing. The world is quiet. The morning comes gently. And somewhere in the growing light, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear it. The ghost of 18,000 men breathing together, pikes at ready, waiting for the command that will never come again. Rest now. The formation has been dismissed. Sleep well.
Your hands are already bleeding. The granite grinding stone has worn through the calluses you've built up over 3 years of this work, and there are still 40 more sacks of emmer wheat to process before the morning offering at Karnak Temple. The woman working beside you has arms like a soldier's. She'll be dead of tooth abscesses before she turns 30. You can hear her grinding rhythm, stone against stone, a sound that never stops in this city. Scrape, push, scrape, push. Somewhere in the darkness, a child is crying, but the grinding continues. It always continues. The air tastes like dust, and you cannot remember a time when you didn't have grit between your teeth. Let me take you through what it actually took to make bread in ancient Egypt, step by method. Because this wasn't just baking, this was the foundation of everything. The pyramids weren't built by slaves motivated by whips. They were built by workers paid in bread, calculated down to the loaf. Temple economies ran on bread. Taxes were paid in grain. When Egyptian scribes wrote about wealth, they counted it in sacks of barley. When they wrote about poverty, they described a house with no bread. One Middle Kingdom text lists a worker's ration as 10 loaves per day. 10. Not because Egyptians were gluttons, but because their bread was dense, small, and constituted nearly 70% of their caloric intake, according to analysis of worker village remains at Deir el-Medina. So we start where all bread starts, with grain and a rock. The grinding is worse than you imagine. Archaeological analysis of Egyptian mummy teeth shows wear patterns consistent with a diet containing significant sand and stone particles. Not occasional grit, constant grit. Every meal, every day, wearing down enamel to the pulp. The Egyptologist Rosalie David examined hundreds of mummies and found severe dental disease in nearly every adult, with abscesses so deep they had eaten through jawbone. The grinding stones were the culprit. You're kneeling in front of a saddle quern. That's the technical term, though no Egyptian ever called it that. It's 2 pieces of granite. The bottom stone is slightly concave, about 2 feet long and a foot wide. The top stone is smaller, loaf-shaped, smooth on top where your hands grip. rough on the bottom where it meets grain. The emmer wheat in front of you came from the temple granaries. Emmer was the main wheat of ancient Egypt, different from modern wheat, tougher. The grains don't separate easily from the chaff, which means yesterday you spent hours threshing, using cattle to trample the stalks on a circular threshing floor while you turned the grain with a wooden fork. Your shoulders still ache from that. Today is grinding. Tomorrow I will be baking. The work never arranges itself conveniently.
You pour a handful of grain onto the lower stone, maybe 2 cups worth. Then you grip the upper stone and begin to push forward. The grain cracks under pressure. You pull back. The sound changes to a scrape. Push forward. The muscles in your forearms burn. Pull back. You develop a rhythm, because rhythm is the only thing that makes this bearable. Push, breathe, pull, breathe. The grain begins to break down. But here's what the ancient illustrations don't show you. The stones themselves are breaking down too. Microscopic particles of granite are mixing with your flour. Every push forward grinds a tiny amount of stone into powder. Over weeks, over months, the saddle quern develops a deeper groove. Over the years, you need a new stone. And all those granite particles end up in the bread. An Egyptian worker woman grinding grain would spend 3 to 4 hours daily at this task, based on experimental archaeology conducted by Delwyn Samuel at University College London. She replicated the entire Egyptian bread-making process using period techniques. 3 hours to produce enough flour for a family's daily bread. Your knees go numb against the mud brick floor. The sound of other grinders around you creates a percussive rhythm, not quite synchronized. Scrape, push, scrape, push. Someone starts singing to mark the rhythm. An old song about the Nile flood. The grain gradually becomes flour, though not the flour you're imagining. This is coarse, more like what we'd call a whole wheat meal, except rougher. You can see flecks of bran, dark specks that might be grain, might be stone. You don't sieve yet. That comes later. For now, you're just trying to break down the grain enough that it will mix with water. The pile of flour grows slowly. Your back begins to hurt in that specific way that means you'll be stiff tomorrow. The basket beside you is marked with hieroglyphs indicating its temple property. Everything here belongs to the temple. The grain, the stones, the ovens outside, even technically your labor, though you're paid in rations, bread and beer, sometimes onions, occasionally dried fish. As you work through the pre-dawn hours here in this bakery, and if you're finding these details as fascinating as I do, subscribe for more journeys into the practical realities of ancient daily life. The grain you're processing tells a story about Egyptian agriculture. Emmer wheat and barley were the 2 main grains, with emmer dominant for bread and barley primarily for beer, though both could be used for either. Emmer is a hulled wheat. The individual grains stay wrapped in tough chaff even after threshing. This made it harder to process, but better for storage. Grain could last years in sealed granaries without spoiling. Egypt's wealth was its grain surplus. In years of good floods, the Nile Valley produced more food than its population could consume. That surplus supported the priesthood, the administrators, the army, the craftsmen, and the massive building projects we remember them for.
You learned to identify grain quality young. Good emmer has a reddish color and feels heavy in your hand. Each grain should be plump. If the grain is shriveled or light, the harvest is poor. Maybe the flood was too low that year and the fields didn't get enough water. Maybe it was too high and washed away the planting. The Nile flood was everything. It determined how much you ate, how hard you worked, whether there would be building projects with extra rations or lean years of shortbread. The flood hasn't come yet this year. It's late summer, the hottest part of the year before inundation. The Nile is at its lowest. You can walk across mudflats that will be under 15 feet of water in 2 months. Everyone watches the river nervously. The grain you're grinding now came from last year's harvest. The granaries are maybe 2/3 full. Not bad, but not comfortable either. Your hands cramp. You pause to shake them out, then continue. The rhythm has to be maintained. You've seen women who could grind for 6 hours straight during the preparation for major festivals, when the temples needed thousands of extra loaves. You're not that strong yet, but you're learning. The grinding stone develops heat from friction. Your flour is slightly warm when you finally finish one basket and move it aside. The next basket waits. Always another basket. The woman beside you stands up with a groan, presses her hands into her lower back and stretches. She's been at this since before you arrived, and she'll continue after you leave. This is her job. Only her job. Some workers specialized in grinding, others in baking. The large temple bakeries operated like production lines, each person perfecting one part of the process. But in a household, one person did everything. Grinding, sieving, mixing, shaping, baking. The tomb autobiographies of noblemen sometimes mention how many workers they employed, and they always list bakers and brewers separately from other servants. These were skilled positions. A good baker was valuable. The flour from your first basket fills a wide clay bowl. You cover it with a cloth to keep flies out. Flies are everywhere in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians had a hieroglyph for fly. They gave golden fly pendants as military honors for persistent valor. The fly was associated with persistence. Anyone who has tried to eat in the Egyptian heat understands why. You pull the next basket toward you. More grain. You're not thinking about the bread this will become. You're just focused on the motion. Push, breathe, pull, breathe. Your world narrows to the stones, the grain, the sound. This is meditation of a sort, though no Egyptian would have called it that. This is just work.
Outside, the sky is beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but that gray moment before sunrise, when you can start to distinguish shapes. A donkey brays somewhere in the city. Thebes is waking up. Soon the streets will fill with people heading to market, to fields, to workshops. The Nile will start its daily traffic of boats. But here, the work that started in darkness continues. The rhythm of grinding doesn't stop for dawn. Your second basket is nearly complete when you notice the stone is starting to feel wrong. There's a rough patch developing where your hand grips. You pause to examine it. A small piece of granite has chipped off, leaving a sharp edge. You'll need to smooth that down or it will cut your palm. You take another stone, a round one kept for this purpose, and rub it against the sharp spot. The rasp of stone on stone adds a new sound to the bakery's rhythm. After a few minutes, the edge is duller. Not gone, but manageable. This is the hidden cost of bread. The tools destroy themselves through use. The stones wear down, clay baking molds crack from repeated heating. Nothing lasts. Everything has to be replaced, maintained, repaired.
The temples employed specialized workers just to maintain bakery equipment. Grain grinding wore out more stone than any other industry in Egypt. You return to grinding. The pile of flour grows. Your arms are shaking now from fatigue, but there's satisfaction in seeing the work accumulate. These loaves will feed temple workers today. Men who are carving inscriptions in the temple walls, women who are weaving linen for priest garments, children who run messages between different temple departments. The bread you're making connects to all of it. The overseer walks past. He glances at your work, nods, and continues. He doesn't need to speak. You're keeping pace. The baskets are being processed in the expected time. In large temple bakeries, efficiency was tracked carefully. Administrators kept records of grain allotted versus bread produced. The numbers had to match. Theft from temple stores was a serious crime. One Middle Kingdom text describes punishment for workers caught stealing grain. The penalties were harsh enough that the text doesn't describe them explicitly, just refers to them as what was done to thieves. But small amounts disappeared anyway. They always did. A handful of flour stuck to the grinding stone, gathered up and taken home. Bread that broke during baking, considered unsuitable for offerings, eaten by the workers. The system had acceptable loss built in. The administrators weren't stupid. They knew workers would take some. They only punished obvious theft, the kind that threatened the temple's operations.
You finish the second basket. Your quota is 5 baskets before the baking begins. You're almost halfway done. The woman beside you has moved on to sieving, using a woven reed sieve to separate fine flour from coarse bran. The sieving produces different grades of flour. The finest would be used for bread offered to gods or nobility. Coarser flour made bread for workers. The bran itself wasn't wasted. It could be mixed back in for hearty bread, fed to animals, or used in beer making. Egyptian society ran on these gradations of quality. Not everyone ate the same bread. The worker rations mentioned in texts describe specific quantities and types. 10 white loaves and 20 coarse loaves for a worker at Deir el-Medina. White bread was of higher status, made from more refined flour, less grit, softer texture. Coarse bread was daily sustenance, dense, tough, full of bran and stone particles. You start the third basket. Push, breathe, pull, breathe. Your mind wanders. You think about the harvest coming, whether the flood will be good, whether there will be enough work. These bakery jobs are steady, but not guaranteed. If the temple reduces its workforce, the newest workers go first. You've only been here 8 months. There are women who have worked at this bakery for 20 years. They have authority, respect, the better positions away from the hottest ovens. The grinding continues. The sun rises outside, light starting to angle through the high windows. The bakery is windowless at ground level to keep it cool, but has openings near the roof for ventilation. The light is dusty, thick with flour particles that hang in the air. Everyone's skin has a pale coating by midday. You taste flour constantly. It's in your throat, your nose, your ears. You wash it out in the evening, and by morning, it's back. This is the foundation of civilization. Not the pyramids, not the temples. This. Grain ground into flour, mixed with water, baked into bread. The pyramid builders ate before they built. The priests performed rituals after they were fed. Everything else was possible because of this labor, this endless grinding, this daily transformation of hard seed into edible food. Your third basket is done. 2 more to go. The pile of flour grows. Your hands have settled into the motion completely now. You're not thinking about it. The body knows what to do.
This is muscle memory, built up over months of repetition. Push, pull, push. The sound continues around you. 10 women grinding. A rhythm like waves on a shore, constant and inevitable. The fourth basket. Your back is genuinely hurting now. You adjust your kneeling position, trying to find relief. The mud brick floor is slightly damp. Someone must have spilled water earlier. The dampness is actually pleasant, cooler against your knees. You think about nothing in particular. Just the grain, the stone, the motion. This is what most of life was for most of human history. Repetitive physical labor. The transformation of raw materials into usable products. Hands and tools and time. The grain in this basket is slightly different. The color is a bit darker. This might be from a different field or stored in a different granary. You can't tell by grinding whether it will make good bread. That comes later in the mixing and rising. Some flour just works better. The proteins bind differently. The dough rises more reliably. Bakers learn to recognize good grain through experience, through hundreds of batches. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed from baker to baker, mother to daughter, master to apprentice. You finish the fourth basket. One more. Your arms are trembling with fatigue. The woman next to you is taking a break, drinking beer from a clay cup. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and slightly sour, more like liquid bread than what we call beer. Workers drank it throughout the day. It was safer than water, more caloric than water, and mildly alcoholic enough to make the work slightly more bearable. She offers you the cup. You drink. The beer is warm and grainy and wonderful. You hand it back and return to the last basket. The day has fully begun outside. You can hear the city now. Vendors calling, donkeys, the slap of sandals on stone streets. The temple itself has come alive. Priests are performing morning rituals. Somewhere in the complex, scribes are recording yesterday's work. Officials are meeting about administration. Life is continuing in all its complexity. And here you are, grinding grain, as women have done in this place for thousands of years, as they will continue to do, though you don't know this, for thousands more. The motion is ancient. The tools are ancient. The grain varieties are ancient. You're participating in something that predates pyramids, that will outlast dynasties. The daily act of making bread. You finish the fifth basket as the morning heat begins to build. The grinding is done. Now comes sieving, then mixing, then the actual baking. But the hardest part is over. Your hands are sore but not bleeding today. Small victories. You stand up slowly, your knees protesting, your back stiff. You stretch. Around you, the bakery continues its work. The sound of grinding doesn't stop. It never really stops. Outside, the ovens are being heated. You can smell the smoke already, that particular scent of burning acacia wood and straw. Time to begin the next phase. Time to turn this flour into bread. The sieving takes place in a separate area, slightly raised to catch any breeze that might come through. You pour your coarsely ground flour into a large reed sieve, circular, about 2 feet across. The weaving is tight enough to catch bran and coarse particles, but open enough to let fine flour through. You shake the sieve in a circular motion. The movement is all in the wrists. If you use your whole arms, you'll tire quickly. The fine flour falls through into a clay vessel below. What remains in the sieve is darker, coarser. Bran, unground grain fragments, and the thing nobody mentions in the archaeological texts, but every baker knows is there, stone dust. Fine granite particles mixed with grain husks and wheat bran.
This coarse material isn't discarded. It goes into worker bread. The high-status white bread gets sieved multiple times. Worker bread might not be sieved at all, just ground and used. The motion of sieving is rhythmic, like grinding, but easier on the body. You're standing now, which is a relief after hours of kneeling. The morning is heating up. The bakery, even with its high ventilation windows, is beginning to feel warm. By midday, it will be oppressive. Most of the actual baking happens in the early morning or evening when temperatures are more manageable. Your fine flour accumulates. The texture is still coarse by modern standards. Run it between your fingers and you feel grittiness. But it's workable. It will absorb water and form dough. That's the essential test of flour quality. Will it make dough that holds together? The woman who was grinding beside you earlier is now preparing yeast. This is chemistry, though no Egyptian understood it that way. They knew that if you saved a piece of dough from one day's baking and added it to the next day's batch, the bread would rise better. The explanation was religious or magical. The dough contained life force or blessing or the favor of particular gods. The reality was wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, naturally occurring microorganisms that found the dough mixture ideal for growth. She's working with a piece of yesterday's dough, about the size of 2 fists. It's been stored in a covered clay pot, kept damp with a wet cloth over the opening. The dough smells sour, not unpleasant, but definitely fermented. This is a sourdough starter, though that term is modern. Egyptians just called it old dough. She tears the old dough into small pieces and drops them into a large pottery bowl. Then she adds water. Not Nile water directly from the river. That would be unsafe, full of parasites and bacteria that cause disease. This is water that has been stored in porous clay pots for several days. The clay filters some impurities, and the standing time allows particles to settle. It's not clean by modern standards, but it's better than fresh river water.
The water and old dough get mixed by hand, squeezed and pressed until the old dough begins to dissolve into a cloudy liquid. This liquid is the yeast starter. It will be mixed into fresh flour to create new dough. The process carries the yeast culture forward day after day, potentially for years. Some bakeries claimed their starter dough went back generations. Whether that was literally true or not, the pride was real. A good starter was valuable. While she prepares the starter, you begin measuring flour. Not with scales or cups, with your hands. A double handful is a measure. An experienced baker knows by feel how much flour is needed. The measures are informal, but surprisingly consistent. When archaeologists did experimental baking using Egyptian methods, they found that handfuls varied by less than 10% between different bakers. The human hand is a decent measuring tool when you use it daily for years. You're making coarse bread today, worker rations. This means the flour doesn't need additional sieving. You use what you have. You pour several handfuls into a large dough bowl, a pottery vessel about 3 feet across at the mouth, tapering to a narrow base. The bowl's interior is smooth from years of use, stained dark from thousands of batches of dough. The starter gets added to the flour. The woman pours maybe 2 cups of the cloudy yeast water into your bowl. Then comes more plain water, added gradually. Too much water and the dough becomes sticky, unworkable. Too little and it won't come together properly. You add water and begin to mix. The mixing is done by hand. You plunge both hands into the bowl and squeeze the flour and water together. The flour is cold, the water tepid. The combination feels grainy between your fingers.
You squeeze and fold, squeeze and fold. The mixture gradually goes from dry crumbs to a shaggy mass to something approaching cohesive dough. This takes time. Delwen Samuel's experimental archaeology found that Egyptian bread dough required 15 to 20 minutes of hand mixing to develop properly. Your hands disappear into the mixture up to your wrists. Flour dust clouds up with each fold. You develop a rhythm. Squeeze, fold, turn the bowl slightly, repeat. Your forearms are getting another workout after the grinding. Everything about bread making is physical labor. The dough begins to change texture. It becomes smoother, more elastic. This is gluten developing, the protein networks forming that will trap gas from yeast fermentation and allow the bread to rise. The Egyptians didn't know about gluten. They just knew that kneading made bread better. More kneading meant softer bread. Less kneading meant dense, heavy loaves.
For worker bread, you don't knead excessively. The goal is basic bread, nutrition, not luxury. The dough just needs to hold together enough to form loaves and bake without falling apart. You work it for maybe 10 minutes, then judge it ready. The test is whether it pulls away from the bowl sides cleanly. If it does, it's ready. If it's still sticky, it needs more flour or more kneading. You cover the bowl with a damp cloth. The dough needs to rest and rise. In Egyptian heat, this happens quickly, maybe 2 hours for the first rise. The yeast in the starter begins feeding on sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide bubbles that make the dough expand. The dough also continues to hydrate. Flour particles absorb water fully over time, which improves texture. While your dough rises, you prepare the baking molds. Egyptian bread was often baked in ceramic molds, tall, conical shapes like flower pots. The molds were heated in fire first, then the dough was pressed into them. The hot ceramic baked the outside of the bread quickly, creating a crust that held the shape. The technique produced cylindrical loaves that were easy to count, stack, and ration. The molds are stacked near the ovens. They've been used hundreds of times. Each one is darkened with carbon and cracked from repeated heating and cooling. Eventually, they'll break completely and need replacement. The temple potter makes new molds constantly. Nothing lasts forever in a working bakery. You select 6 molds, checking each for major cracks. Small cracks are fine. Large ones will cause the mold to shatter in the fire. You carry the molds to the oven area. The heat hits you immediately. The ovens have been burning since before dawn, fed with acacia wood and palm fronds. The temperature is intense. Egyptian ovens were simple but effective. Large clay domes or cylinders may be 5 feet tall and 3 feet across at the base. The fire burned inside on the oven floor. Bread could be baked directly on the hot floor, on the oven walls, or in molds placed inside the oven chamber. Different breads required different techniques. For molded bread, the molds themselves had to be heated first. You place your 6 molds directly in the fire, arranged around the edges where they'll heat evenly. The clay begins to glow slightly as it absorbs heat. This takes maybe 20 minutes. While you wait, you check on other loaves already baking. The smell of baking bread fills this part of the bakery. It's a good smell, toasty and complex, but underneath it is always the smoke. Your eyes water slightly from the smoke. All bakery workers have irritated eyes. The smoke is constant and unavoidable. Some workers develop serious eye problems. Cataracts were common in ancient Egypt, possibly linked to smoke exposure and bright sunlight. The baker tending the ovens is an older man, thin and muscular, with burn scars on his forearms. He's been doing this job for 30 years. He can judge oven temperature by holding his hand near the opening and counting how long he can keep it there. 2 seconds means the oven is ready for bread. 1 second means it's too hot. 3 seconds means it needs more fuel. He nods toward your molds. They're ready.
Using 2 wooden paddles, he pulls them from the fire and sets them upright on a sand-covered patch of floor. The molds are glowing. You can feel heat radiating from them at 3 feet away. You need to work quickly now before they cool. Back at your dough bowl, the dough has risen. It's increased in size by maybe 50%. The surface is slightly domed, with small bubbles visible. You punch it down, deflating the gas bubbles, and begin tearing off pieces. Each piece is about the size of a large orange. You shape them quickly into rough balls. The hot molds wait. You return with your dough balls and the wooden paddle. This is the dangerous part. The molds are hot enough to cause severe burns. You work carefully. Take 1 dough ball, press it into the paddle surface, then quickly press it down into the hot mold. The dough sizzles. The smell of baking bread intensifies immediately. The hot ceramic begins baking the dough on contact. You press down, making sure the dough fills the mold's bottom and contacts the sides. Then you repeat with the next mold. 6 molds, 6 dough balls. The work takes maybe 2 minutes. Your face is flushed from the heat. Sweat runs down your temples. The filled molds get placed back into the oven, not directly in the fire, but near it, arranged in a semicircle. The bread will bake from the residual heat in the ceramic and the oven's ambient temperature. Baking time is roughly 30 minutes. You'll know the bread is done when you can turn the molds upside down and the loaves slide out easily, and when they sound hollow if tapped. While those bake, you start another batch. The work proceeds in waves. Mix dough, let it rise, heat molds, shape and bake, repeat. A skilled baker can keep 3 or 4 batches at different stages going simultaneously. The rhythm becomes intuitive. You always know which batch needs attention next. The woman working beside you is making flatbread. This is a simpler technique. The dough is rolled thin, about the thickness of your finger, then baked directly on the oven floor or on the inner wall of the oven. The bread bakes quickly, maybe 5 minutes, emerging as flat discs that are flexible when hot, crisp when cool. This style of bread is ancient. It predates molds, predates leavening. It's just flour, water, and fire. She shapes the flatbread by hand, slapping the dough between her palms to thin it, then tossing it from hand to hand like a potter throwing clay. The motion is practiced and quick. When the flat dough is ready, she uses a long wooden peel to slap it against the inner wall of a different oven, one dedicated to flatbreads. The dough sticks to the hot wall and bakes in place. When done, she uses the peel to scrape it off. The flatbread comes out spotted with brown marks where it contacted the hottest parts of the wall. It smells fantastic. This bread won't be for offerings or rations. This is breakfast for the bakery workers. The woman tears a piece while it's still hot and hands it to you. You eat while working. The bread is chewy, slightly charred, wonderful.
Your molded loaves are ready. You can tell because the smell has changed from baking to slightly scorched. Another minute and they'd burn. The older baker helps you remove the molds from the oven. Using paddles and thick leather gloves, he pulls them out and sets them upright to cool slightly. After 5 minutes, the molds are cool enough to handle with gloves. You turn each one upside down and tap the bottom. The loaves slide out perfectly. 6 cylindrical breads, golden brown, slightly cracked on top. They're beautiful in their own utilitarian way. Uniform, stackable, ready to be counted and distributed. You set them on a reed mat to cool completely. The bread is still baking slightly from internal heat. The crust crackles as it cools, releasing steam. You can't eat this bread immediately. The interior is still too hot, almost doughy. It takes 30 minutes to finish setting. The bread you've made will be marked with the bakery stamp,
and added to today's distribution. Somewhere, a scribe is recording the production. 6 loaves, coarse grade, temple worker rations. The number will be checked against the flour used. The accounting is meticulous. Egypt ran on bureaucracy. Everything was counted, recorded, verified. You start another batch. The work continues. By midday, you'll have produced 30 loaves. Other workers will produce similar amounts. The bakery will produce several hundred loaves today. Tomorrow, you'll do it again. The day after that, again. The bread feeds the temple system, which feeds the civilization, which builds the monuments we remember 3,000 years later. But right now, at this moment, it's just bread. Flour and water and fire. The daily sustenance that kept people alive. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, just the fundamental alchemy that turns grain into food. The sun is higher now. The bakery is getting hot. The ovens make it hotter. You're sweating freely. Everyone is. The work continues anyway, because the work has to continue. People need to eat. The bread must be made. You think briefly about the differences in bread types. The coarse loaves you're making versus the white bread for nobility. Temple offerings versus worker rations. Egyptian society was stratified clearly in its bread. The pyramid texts, inscribed in Old Kingdom pyramids, mention white bread and beer as sustenance for the deceased king. White bread was royal food. Coarse bread was everyone else's food. But even coarse bread was valuable. The tomb of Ka, an architect at Deir el-Medina, contained actual loaves of bread buried with him. 3,000-year-old bread preserved by Egypt's dry climate. When archaeologists analyzed it, they found barley and emmer wheat flour, coarse ground, baked in molds exactly like the ones you're using now. The recipe hadn't changed in generations. You shape more dough. Your hands move automatically now. The morning is progressing. The work is hard, but there's satisfaction in it. These loaves will feed people. The baker's work is essential. You're not building temples or carving inscriptions, but without your work, none of that happens. The foundation of society is food, and the foundation of food is bread. The sun is higher now. The bakery is getting hot. The ovens make it hotter. You're sweating freely. Everyone is. The work continues anyway, because the work has to continue. People need to eat. The bread must be made. You think briefly about the differences in bread types. The coarse loaves you're making versus the white bread for nobility. Temple offerings versus worker rations. Egyptian society was stratified clearly in its bread. The pyramid texts, inscribed in Old Kingdom pyramids, mention white bread and beer as sustenance for the deceased king. White bread was royal food. Coarse bread was everyone else's food. But even coarse bread was valuable. The tomb of Ka, an architect at Deir el-Medina, contained actual loaves of bread buried with him. 3,000-year-old bread, preserved by Egypt's dry climate. When archaeologists analyzed it, they found barley and emmer wheat flour, coarse ground, baked in molds exactly like the ones you're using now. The recipe hadn't changed in generations. You shape more dough. Your hands move automatically now. The morning is progressing. The work is hard, but there's satisfaction in it. These loaves will feed people. The baker's work is essential. You're not building temples or carving inscriptions, but without your work, none of that happens. The foundation of society is food, and the foundation of food is bread.
Another batch goes into the molds. Another batch comes out. The pile of finished loaves grows. The overseer comes by again, counts them, nods approval. You're on pace. The work is acceptable. By late morning, your quota is nearly complete. Your arms are sore. Your back hurts. You smell like smoke and sweat and bread. But the work is good. the bread is good. You've done what needed doing. The older baker is telling a story to the younger apprentices, something about a nobleman who tried to make bread himself and ruined a whole batch because he didn't know how to judge oven temperature. The apprentices laugh. The story is probably not true, but it doesn't matter. It's a baker's story, part of the culture, part of what makes this work bearable. You finish your last batch. The loaves cool on their mats. You help clean the work area, scraping dough scraps off the mixing bowl, wiping flour dust off surfaces. Cleaning is important. Old dough scraps attract rats and insects. A clean bakery is a functioning bakery. The distribution begins in the afternoon. Workers from different temple departments line up. Each one has a ration assigned. The scribe calls out names and ration amounts from a papyrus scroll. Amenhotep, stone carver, 10 coarse loaves and 2 white. Workers collect their bread in baskets or carry it wrapped in cloth. You watch your loaves being distributed. The bread you ground and mixed and baked is now going to feed people. There's something deeply satisfying about that. The immediacy of the work. You made something people need. Today. Right now. Not abstract or theoretical. Real bread that fills real bellies. The bakery will produce more bread this evening for tomorrow's distribution. The work never really stops. There are always more mouths to feed. Always more grain to grind. The rhythm continues. Day after day, year after year. This is what civilization looks like up close. Not monuments, not grand histories, just daily labor, repeated endlessly, creating the foundation everything else rests on. The bread-making methods of ancient Egypt were sophisticated, developed over thousands of years of practice. The techniques were efficient and adaptable. The same basic process could produce dozens of bread varieties by varying flour fineness, water content, fermentation time, baking method, and additional ingredients. Some breads contained dates or honey for sweetness. Others included coriander seeds or tiger nuts. Special breads for festivals might be shaped into elaborate forms representing animals or symbols. The bread offerings found in tombs show incredible variety. Conical loaves, flat discs, spiral shapes, triangular pieces. Each had its place in the culture. But the foundation was always the same. Grain, water, fermentation, heat. The basic chemistry of bread making hasn't changed since the Neolithic Revolution. The Egyptians perfected techniques that are still recognizable today. A modern baker examining Egyptian bread molds would understand immediately how they worked. You leave the bakery in the afternoon heat. The Nile shimmers in the distance. Thebes sprawls around you, a city of mud brick and limestone, of temples and markets and homes. The city runs on bread. The grain you ground this morning is now distributed through the temple economy, traded, consumed, converted into labor and art and architecture.
Tomorrow, you'll return and grind more grain, make more bread. The work continues. The civilization continues. And it all rests on this foundation, the daily transformation of grain into bread, the endless labor that keeps people fed. The sun is hot on your shoulders as you walk home. Your hands ache, your back is stiff, but the work is done for today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. For now, you have your own ration of bread, and that's enough. The evening settles over Thebes. The heat begins to ease slightly. The Nile turns gold in the lowering sun. Boats drift toward shore. Workers return from fields and workshops. Smoke rises from cooking fires as families prepare evening meals. The city breathes and moves and lives. And in the bakeries, the work continues. The ovens cool slowly. The grinding stones are set aside for tomorrow. The starter dough is refreshed and covered, ready to carry the yeast forward into another day. The tools are cleaned, the floors are swept, the bakery settles into the evening quiet. But it's never really quiet. Even now, you can hear the faint sound of grinding from somewhere in the city. Some bakeries work through the evening. Some woman kneeling at a saddle quern, pushing and pulling, transforming grain into flour. The sound that never stops. The sound of bread being made. The sound of survival. The stars begin to appear overhead, the same stars that have watched over this valley for thousands of years, the same stars that will watch for thousands more. And beneath them, the work continues. The bread is made, the people are fed, the civilization persists. This is the story they don't tell in the grand histories. The daily labor, the aching hands, the stone dust in the flour, the hours of grinding and kneading and baking, the practical reality of keeping a civilization fed. It's not glorious, but it's real, and it's what mattered most to most people most of the time. The bread-making methods of ancient Egypt were a triumph of practical knowledge, techniques refined over generations, solutions to the problem of turning grain into food efficiently and reliably. The methods worked because they had to work. Failure meant hunger. Success meant survival. The night deepens. Thebes grows quiet. The temple complex settles into darkness, lit only by torches at important buildings. The priests complete evening rituals. The workers sleep in their quarters. The city rests, gathering energy for tomorrow. In the bakeries, the starter dough sits in its clay pot. The wild yeast is dormant, but not dead, waiting for tomorrow's mixing, waiting to rise again. The cycle continues. Grain to flour, flour to dough, dough to bread, bread to life. The Nile flows north as it always has, as it always will. The water that feeds the fields, that makes the grain possible, that sustains everything. The great river in the desert, the source of Egypt's wealth and power. But even the Nile is just water without the labor that transforms its gift into food. The grinding stones rest, the ovens cool. The work waits for morning, but it will begin again. It always begins again. The sun will rise, the workers will return, the grain will be ground, the bread will be made. This is the eternal rhythm, the foundation beneath kingdoms and dynasties and monuments. The simple act of making bread, the daily miracle that kept civilization alive.
The moon rises over Thebes, silver light on mud brick and limestone. The city sleeps. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Tomorrow and more grain, more grinding, more bread. The work that never ends because people always need to eat. And in that work, in that endless daily labor, is the real story of ancient Egypt. Not the pharaohs and pyramids, but the bakers and brewers, the grinders and sievers, the people who made the bread that fed the civilization that built the monuments we remember. The bread was everything. The bread was survival. The bread was life itself. And the making of that bread was the most important work in Egypt. More important than carving inscriptions or building tombs, because without bread, there was nothing else. The night is quiet now. The stars wheel overhead, the Nile flows on, the city rests, and in the morning the work will begin again. The stones will grind, the dough will rise, the ovens will burn, the bread will be made, as it has been made for thousands of years, as it will be made for thousands more. The eternal work, the foundation of everything, the simple, essential, exhausting work of making bread.